back in the studio here at the Engine Performance Expo Diesel Roundtable Lake. So Cass has rejoined us. Good morning, Cass. How are you?
Doing good.
Of course, Chuck Lynch and Chris here. What'd you say? You're here for comic relief?
I'm here for comic relief, yes, Joe.
And Matt Hussey with us. We're going to get in a little deeper with Matt a little bit later today. But it's kind of interesting. Like, we've carved out these features for diesel conversation. But it's not, it's not that separate from the rest of it. What have you guys been taking in from the expo so far? Cass, I'm looking right at you because you're the diesel master.
So there's cashews and M&Ms. There's a lot of snacks in the back. No, I'm just kidding. That's your job, right? The comic relief.
Yes.
Sorry. No, it's always great. Like I mentioned yesterday, just getting to talk to guys. There's a lot of. At the end of the day, a diesel engine doesn't know it's a diesel engine. It just knows it's a standard pump. So a lot of the things carry over from, guys like Darren Morgan or guys like Billy Godbold. There's so much there that, you get to hang out with those guys and talk. And even though that they're not per se diesel guys, there's a lot of technology that still, infiltrates itself and finds itself into our world.
Well, I see the work. I've been to your shop, and I see the work that you guys are doing there, and it's that progression that, just like we were talking about with the previous roundtable with the Dortons, that as you begin to go further and further away from what the OE designed it for, I think back to what Darren was doing this morning, it's like you start pushing that limit, you have to now start bringing in like the connecting rods and the stuff you've done in the previous segments. Talk a little bit about when you're trying to build something big power, because diesels are big. I mean, they're already pretty massive engines. They're robustly built, but it doesn't mean that means, you can just put 1,000 horsepower to it and you're good.
So the things that are major, the major differences in diesel is torque tears up everything. That's the thing that is just so destructive. And piston speed has a tremendous amount to do with that, with compression ratio on top of the piston, and we're slowing the piston speed down. You can do the math off of it and find out, at a given RPM range that we're going to operate, our piston speed may be 25, 27 miles per hour going back and forth in a, 4-inch, 134 stroke.
And having to stop each time.
And having to stop and reverse. It's busy. It's got a lot going on. But because the piston is so much slower than that of a 8,000 RPM engine, it is what we call there's a longer duration that it has to maintain that load. So there's a lot of torsional forces that are acting on that. So bottom end is always a big problem with the diesel. I use this analogy all the time. When I was flying aerobatics, we would do high G maneuvers, but the maneuvers that we would do, we might pull 8 Gs, 9 Gs on doing this, which sounds like a tremendous amount, and it is. But, you got guys that are flying F-18s, and they may pull 8 Gs, but, these guys are wearing G suits, but we're not. Well, what's the difference? The difference is that unless I did like a split S and pulled it around where I have a lot of kinetic energy, and then I can pull it all the way through the bottom and hold that load, I don't have to worry so much about G-lock and all the things that are that are going on with that. The big difference is the amount of time, the sustain. If I say this microphone, right, is it heavy? You would say no. And I say, okay, great, hold it here. I'll be back in 8 hours. And you tell me, is it heavy? There's a lot of difference. Now, that's because we're slowing that piston speed down. Difference between that and maybe a big block Chevy or whatever, gasoline engine here. So we have all that load that's staying for a lot longer. And that's where we really start running into problems. And that's the reason why, we might match up a bigger single turbo with a different AR housing, a different compressor wheel and exhaust. That is going to push the RPM up higher. That's going to increase our piston speed. Our duration now is not as long. Parts live longer lives when they're happier. And so there's a lot of things that are different, though, in the world because of the RPM range and the compression ratio that we're dealing with, the cylinder pressures. So that's the major things when we're looking at fixing things. It's starting. I'm looking really the two ends of the spectrum: the bottom end and where the head gasket is, right? And it's always the fuse.
We're going to get to there later today on the head gasket side, But
and the fuse moves. You've got a guy that says, me and Chuck talk about this all the time. But you have the guys out there that say, I keep tripping that 20 amp breaker. You know, all I need to do is just put a 50 amp in that thing, and next thing you know, the fire department's at the house and it's burning to the ground. The guy goes, I don't know what happened, right? The breaker was initially it was tripping, but the wire couldn't support it, right? So that 12 gauge wire is now fried in the house, and the house burnt down. We're always moving that fuse to see what the next thing is that's causing the problem, and that's just development.
So in that bottom end system, what is the weak link, man? I remember being at your place before, and when we went and visited some people together. When you look at one of those wrist pins, those things are significant.
Yeah.
Especially you compare, if we had one of those wrist pins from one of yours and put one of Ben Strader's wrist pins from Spinal Tap next door, I'm pretty sure the Spinal Tap pin would fit right through the center of your pin and have lots of clearance.
All day.
Yeah.
We got 1,800 plus grams of bob weight here, closer to 19 at times. His analogy is exact. Can I stop a Honda from 60 to 0 easier, or can I stop a freight train loaded down with inertia? Who's going to stop first? I'm trying to sling 1,900 grams here. Talk to any of these gas guys in this show right now and ask them what their bob weights are. They'll be, and when we tell me and Cass tell them what our bob weights are, they're like, "Are you kidding me?"
Our piston weighs as much as their assembly.
Yeah.
Right.
830 grams on a 6.4, 30 over pistons, about 825 to 830 grams.
Piston
rings.
without the pin.
The pin, no, that's
with the pin.
Yeah, that's with the pin. So it weighs about 830 grams. I mean, you could tell me, with pretty close to what y'all would see. But that's a good example of seeing the differences, between the two. So that's a major deal. Now you're asking about what, where's the weak link? It's a lot of force. Where's the weak link? And the answer is I'll return a question. What engine platform are we talking about?
Right.
It's not all the same. I could take a Cummins rod and I can make, depending on what year that rod is, before the common rail, they were all a forged rod, and now they're a powdered metal rod, but they're different years, makes, model. They all have their own, they're all different entities, and they all have their own weak links. So we talk, 6 liter, well, okay, head gasket failure. First thing that the guy's going to think of is this 4 bolts per cylinder head. That's going to be your head gasket failure. We talk about maybe a 6.4, it may be a completely different bottom end issue. If you look at the surface area of the bearing versus compare it to maybe a Cummins, there's a huge difference there. If we move it over to maybe a Duramax, that may be issues that we might start seeing with even crankshafts, maybe not, connecting rods. It's just a mix and match of parts, and it is a lot in the mindset. And the thing I like and I really enjoy about is understanding the mindset of the engineer for the application. Cummins is an engine company. Right. So the reason why their internal components are heavier in this application is because they're going to use it over a broader span of applications. Yeah. Exactly. So
they didn't build that engine for that truck.
Right. It's a marine application. It's a gen set. It's a stationary power. It might be mining, gas. Who knows what it's going to be used for? It's a lot cheaper to build one part that will do multiple things than to be one, isolated. And you look at a Ford Power Stroke International's version of it, right, which is 7.3 all the way to 6.4. That's intent was pickup truck, class 4. That's the range and it operates in, right? So there are different things that we start seeing that will fail in certain areas for those reasons. It's design intent is what it boils down to.
Yeah, you and I spoke about the B-Series Cummins many years ago, going back to the 90s. This particular engine application replaced the Perkins for the most applications because it was in tractors, it was in generators. Okay, I got 1,470 applications for this one engine platform. So, you have to build with all of that in mind, that this is going everywhere. And then, again, you jump back to a truck and the duty cycle that you're even testing for, the amount of engineering you put into it. So, like I say, that's where that fuse, what is the intent and how robust are we going to try to build this because of every climb and place that it may be? So.
That's a very interesting perspective. Yeah, you don't really think about it. You're like, oh, it's a diesel, right? And you see the truck, and you just kind of forget about that. Yeah, there is a thought process and engineering procedure that went into building that engine. In some cases, that was designed for the purpose, like you said. That I'm sure when GM did the Duramax, they knew it was going into a vehicle. Well, it was never going to be in a gen set in
the design on the heads on the L5P is nothing short of amazing to me. I've been through them, chopped them up, looked at them, poured moldings of them. I'm a calibrator first. I'm a machinist second. And the design of the port work that they've done on the L5P to promote swirl is probably the best head on planet Earth right now in a pickup truck, in my honest opinion, from what I've seen.
And that's because of emissions, right?
Well, it also, honestly, I mean, I'm sure that's part of the driving factor, but
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
I'll tell you the reason why. I think that I think that they have had to step up their game. We're making 500 horsepower. I don't think that the emissions truly is the issue for that. Swirl is for the reason for emissions. Now, there's a lot of different guys that talk about different things like that. But if you're trying to reintroduce, the combustion event takes place after the fuel is before the fuel. Excuse me. The combustion event takes place as soon as the fuel is injected in. It's not like a gasoline engine where we're mixing and we're tumbling and we're trying to make sure that atomization has occurred because of the mixing of the gases and the oxygen. So the swirl port, really and truly, you start seeing that there's two major advantages for that. Lower RPM velocity, right? So we can get off the seat, we can increase the velocity of the air, we can have a little better throttle response. Totally get that. But the main reason for that, secondary, is so that we can introduce the exhaust gas, the recirculation.
EGR.
So we need to swirl that because we're actually bringing that through the port, right? We're not bringing that into the cylinder.
Right.
So there's quite a bit difference. But yeah, to Matt's point, L5P is absolutely amazing. It's a total redesign, but they're having to keep up with Fords that are making 500 horsepower and the Cummins and everything else. Yeah, so they've done a lot of it.
The EGR part of that makes sense, right? Because you got to manage that EGR if you're going to make power.
And in 2023, Ford just released the HO, the high output for a truck, and we've been fortunate enough to get it tuned and calibrated. We've even done a 24 successfully, and Cummins was the only truck that we knew on the market that would release an HO, high output calibration. And you think about that, that's pretty amazing. That kind of power, that kind of torque. And then our job is to help him too, because we work with a lot of other engine builders as well to help an engine live. Because we're big on larger injectors. And a lot of guys frown on that. We're like, well, what happens as RPM goes up? Well, we start running out of time to inject. So now we start stretching in duration of the injector. We start adding excessive time in, because now we have to start the injection event with the piston so much further down in the bore to get the time we need to get the fuel in. Our EGTs start to get out of control. And then that's where you see the flowering of the bowl. Guys show pictures of how you look. You see a lot of these have like 8 spray patterns, 8 little orifices, and you see this pretty little flower, and you're like, man, it's getting further and further out of the combustion chamber of the piston, and it's working its way further and further to the edge of the piston. Well, what do we do with larger injectors? Well, we don't need as much timing. We don't need near as much duration, and we can get as much or more fuel in where we need it to happen, which is in the combustion chamber. That's why guys delib. The Max Force 13 pistons that everybody's ranting over on the 6.4 is really simple. I can put a Molle OE 6.4 piston right here, and I can put a Max Force, and everybody here, if nobody knew anything about pistons, they could easily go, well, God, that bowl is so much bigger on that Max Force. That's actually a good thing for me, because now as I'm trying to add time and add duration, I'm not getting outside of a small bowl that's creating hot spots. And because let's be honest, it's an aluminum piston, is it not? It's not forged. It's not forged, but it lives longer. There's a reason it lives longer.
Yeah, and that's all about parity. We talked about that a little bit yesterday, though. Once you increase that injector size and volume, you have to make sure that it can still atomize, because if you can't atomize and you're putting droplets in, and that's where swirl and tumble help you keep those droplets beat up so they'll be an atomization, because if they collect and come together, now I have fuel that lays on the piston. You still have auto ignition, but you, instead of having that boundary layer, that exhaust boundary layer that usually gives you some protection so the piston doesn't overheat, now it's on the piston. So you see these pistons that are melted down.
Cass has a whole bunch of those in his place. He wants some examples.
When you pull your exhaust manifold and it's got plugs of aluminum stuck in it,
So it truly, and the thing about that is to kind of expand a little bit about what he's talking about is combustible. Truly, there is more relationship between the tumble, and my persuasion, in the combustion bowl itself, because you got to consider this is being squeezed into a very, very small area, right? So when the injector fires, there's literally nothing left. This is whatever we brought in has already been mashed, but it is the relationship between the combustion bowl and the cylinder itself, the quench volume, right? Then there is the actual port, unless we start talking about, like I said, at lower RPMs and those things there as far as emissions are concerned. That's where that takes place. When guys are manipulating the bowl, whether through delipping or fly cutting, you're doing more to disrupt the design intent there. And for good reason, we know, because of we have hot spots that occur in certain areas of the combustion bowl because it's a reentrant bowl. It's having to reverse flow and go back the other direction, so there's going to be a dwell. It's like taking a rod hone, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to go off the end of and come back on because you don't want to dwell in that one area, so that we have an area of dwell. Mm-hmm. So that's the area that begins to get hot. That's what happens is it starts to break down. Burn holes, things crack, bad things happen.
And talk about atomization. If it wasn't important, we wouldn't see Duramaxes that started life on a CP3 pump. That a common, full throttle pool is about 23 to 24,000 pounds of rail pressure on an older model. Mm-hmm. Now we're well into the 30,000 pounds of rail pressure with these late model 23s and 24s. They're building bigger rails to handle it. They're upgrading the material on the nozzles. And it's like, well, why is that? Because obviously we know what happens as pressure goes up. Atomization just keeps getting better and better and better. You can actually make horsepower on a diesel by doing nothing more than increasing rail pressure. Nothing else.
Right.
Just rail pressure. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Or duration, or
let's dwell on that for a second. Sorry, I know Chris is the comic relief, and I'm bad at puns. Thank you, Joe. So the point is, if you can't atomize it, it will not vaporize. Right. If it doesn't vaporize, you can't burn it.
Let me add something right there. I've been listening to this. So
out the tailpipe.
When we look at designing an intake port on a diesel, it's much different than a gas engine because we want to promote as much swirl. If you think about it, the diesel fuel molecule, it burns like an onion, so you need to peel layers. So the way we look at things is, with the more swirl, you think about peeling an onion, you're able to get those layers off quicker, and then the quicker you can do that, the better and more efficient you burn that molecule. So we promote high swirl. We actually have an enhancement what we do on the intake valve side of things in the diesel engines to help with that low lift number to get that swirl process as quick as possible type deal. So it's a totally different. If you go back to Chevrolet and look at some of the early model Vortec heads, GM was experimenting with swirl with gas because you can literally see it in the port. You can literally see it in the old 7.3 in the way the intake runners and the way they do it. It's almost like a bobsled corner, what they're doing type deal,
right,
to get that air moving like that. So we promote high swirl in any of the port development we do on the diesel side of stuff.
So the 7.3 was before the BGT. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the reasons why you're seeing that on the 7.3 is because it was a non-variable geometry turbo. So the 7.3, the acceleration of the 7.3 is very poor, compared to the 6-liter, right? So to increase the velocity, they add, basically, you've got that port, right? Exactly. So now, because we are narrowing that port down, we're increasing the velocity, so that helps with the instant coming off the throttle. As far as big power go, when you start looking at really big power numbers on these tractor pools, you look at a port and you see right through it. There's nothing. I mean, it's straight. There's no swirl. There's no nothing. Because of the port design between a pickup truck that's on the road and one that's out for all out making power, totally different idea.
Yeah, there's a giant difference between wide open throttle and park throttle.
Right.
Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about that more in depth later. So hang on, hang out all day. Just feel free to sit whatever you're doing. You are learning something, so this counts as work.
And to address the exhaust side, what we look at that type deal, I address that with a camshaft because the highest velocity on the exhaust side, as soon as you crack that valve, okay, it's once out of there. I've been made fun of for years, but I use your favorite carbonated beverage. When you pop that pull tab, have you got to pull it all the way for all the gas get out? So literally, on diesel camshafts, my duration on exhaust side is shorter than what the intake side. And lack of a better term, velocity spools that turbo, so let's hit it and forget it. So I shut the exhaust valve off very quickly on the diesel stuff. And any of my customers you talk to is throttle response is much better like the gas and the whole bit. So in looking at a lot of this type stuff, the crankshaft issues and some of this other stuff can be corrected with some simple, parts. but as what Matt does and what Cass does. But then you built all this power. Now you got to have that bottom end to support it. When that demand grows, now you got to have stronger parts to support that demand.
Fun fact, as my mind wanders, and I know that we've got to wrap up, what is the common thread between, because not only do I like the diesels as the engine, but just as a whole, right? So what's the common thread between Anheuser-Busch and Classy Cummins? As far as what's the common thread between there? Anybody know? You know, don't you? Because I told you. The first purchaser of Cummins engines when they came over, Anheuser-Busch. Mm-hmm. They were the ones that first invested in the company. Oh, wow. Which I thought was very interesting. You would have had a Busch diesel engine if it had have worked out, but there was a parting of the ways. So, or an Anheuser, I don't know how that would have worked.
Well, I guess
doesn't near as cool as Cummins.
I guess they knew that Cummins was going to have to replace the Clydesdales.
I guess so.
Horsepower. Yeah, do with towing heavy gear all around the country and distributing.
Yeah.
They were looking for a better way to do it.
So, speaking of boost, making big fuel, atomization, we're actually going to do a video about the Engine Performance Expo engine and running it on boost and naturally aspirated, and then analyzing the oil, which if you know me, you know is like one of my favorite topics. So stay tuned and watch this one.
What a day, what a day, what a day. Yeah, my brain is swollen. I've learned so much today. They told us, don't start cars. We are not going to listen.